All right, what's up, guys? Nick here with Late Night Chess. Welcome to part 3 of what will eventually be 5-part series in Knight and Pawn Endgames. The first 2 videos we covered how the white knight can draw when the black pawn is on the A or the H file, or when you're fighting against a rook pawn. And now I'm going to show you some positions on how white can fight for a draw when the enemy pawn is on the C, D, E, or F file, or what we would call central pawns. And actually, the concepts in these positions are a lot easier than the rook pawn. So if you were able to understand the concepts in the first 2 videos, I think this one will come pretty naturally to you. So let's take a look at this position here. We're dealing with a central pawn, this d2 pawn, which is 1 square away from promoting. And when you're white in this position and you have a knight, really your objective, if you can, is to get in front of the queening square of the pawn. If you can safely get your knight in front of the queening square of the pawn, that pawn will never be able to promote. So white's plan is going to be very simple. He's just going to move and shuffle his king between these 3 highlighted squares, b2, d1, and f2. And there's really nothing black can do about this, and it's going to end up being a draw. So let's just show a couple moves to demonstrate that. Knight coming to d1. The most logical response for black would be to come to c2, attacking the knight. But then the knight can just simply come to f2, and black is going to lose a lot of time to go all the way on the other side of the board to attack white's knight, because the d1 and the d3 square are blocked off by the knight. So the king would have to do a really weird maneuver. He'd have to go, say, to b3, then to c4, then to d4, and then to e3. And then by that time, once he finally gets to e3, the knight can just simply move to d1, and then if he needs to, go back to b2. And you might be wondering why the black king wouldn't just go to c3 right away, like why I said he'd have to go to b3 first. And that's just because if the king does come to c3, then white wins, or not, doesn't win. White draws and can force a draw immediately. Pause the video if you want to try and find the drawing move for white here. So if you found the move 94, good job. This draws immediately because the knight is checking the black king, and he's also stopping the black pawn, and he's going to be able to take it on the next move. So black probably wouldn't play king c3 here. He'd probably play some other continuation like this. But by the time he gets over to the white knight, there's really no problem. White can come to d1, and after the black king comes and attacks, now white's knight is back on b2, and black has the same problem here. He's not going to be able to go attack the white knight anytime soon, and this black pawn will never be able to promote. So pretty simple. So if you had to take anything away from this, it would be if you can get your knight in front of the queening square of the enemy pawn, it's going to be an easy draw if the pawn is on the C, D, E, or F file. So if the pawn is on one of these 4 files, it's going to be an easy draw if you can get your knight in front of your pawn. So that probably begs the question then, okay, well, what if I can't get my knight in front of the pawn? So let's take a look at this position here. So we have a C pawn. And if you remember what I was saying earlier, we want to try and get our knight to be in the queening square of the pawn, which would be c1. But that's never going to happen because the black king is occupying c1, and the black king is never going to allow white to be able to get to c1. So can white still draw in this position? The answer is actually yes. If white can still draw if he makes sure that he is continually attacking the promotion square. So he needs to be able to threaten c1, and that will prevent black's pawn from promoting. And there's 2 moves here that black could make that threaten c1. The knight could come to d3 or to e2, but it turns out one of these moves is losing, and one of these moves is drawing. So if you want to pause the video again, feel free to pause it and think through what you think is the right move. Okay, so hopefully you were able to find the right continuation, which is knight to e2. And this actually gets back to the previous position where I said that white would want to have these kind of 3 squares to shuffle back and forth in. And so if ever you're not sure which square you want to move your knight to, in this case d3 or e2, just try and remember that 3 highlighted square position, and you'll know you want to move your knight to e2. So before I show you why knight to e2 actually draws, let me first show you why knight to d3 actually loses for white. So If the knight does come to d3, black has the very resourceful king d2. And there's really no good square for the white knight to go that can still defend c1. Obviously, anywhere the white knight goes, he's going to lose control of c1, and black's pawn can promote. Probably white's best chances of drawing would be knight to c5, where white is really hoping that black would promote right away. Because if black did promote right away, if he played c1 equals queen, then white's knight could come to b3, checking the king, and he would be able to pick up the queen. However, this is still not good enough for white to draw because black can play king c3, and after white checks, black moves over to attack the knight. The knight comes back to c5. After the black king comes to c4, there's no good squares for the white knight, and the black pawn is going to be able to promote. So that's why the move knight d3 is actually not the correct continuation. Knight d3 just fails to king d2. But knight e2 makes all the difference. Now this is a draw. And let's take a look at why. Let's first take a look at what happens if the king moves to d2. You might ask yourself, well, why isn't this winning for black? The white knight has to move, and then black's pawn is going to promote. But white has a very resourceful move here. He has knight to d4. And this does look like it allows the black pawn to promote. But if the black pawn promotes, then the white knight has knight to b3 check. And so he's not only checking the black king there, he's also going to pick up the new queen. So after knight d4, there's really no other move for black, though, because white's knight is attacking the pawn. So if the black pawn doesn't promote to a queen, then white's knight will just take it on the next move. So black plays c1 equals queen, white plays knight b3, and now it's a draw. So knight e2, we've seen what happens if king d2. We know that knight d4 is going to draw right on the spot. But what happens if instead the king plays his king to d1? Well, if that's the case, then hopefully the last puzzle or the last example that I showed you gives you a good idea of what white should do here. If white plays knight c3 check, after king d2, look at the position we're in. Knight a2, we're in a very similar position to the last example, where white's knight is preventing black's king from being able to attack the white knight. And the black pawn will never be able to promote because the white knight is on the c1 square. And if black's king ever somehow does happen to get over, let's say to a3 to threaten the knight, well, then the knight can simply come to c1, and this black pawn will never promote. And so if the king did play to d2 here, then the white knight just goes to a2. If the king decides to play to c1 instead, still no problem. You have knight a2. And after king b2, we're in the exact same position. It's just on the left side of the pawn instead of the right side of the pawn. I play knight b4. I'm hitting the pawn. And if the pawn decides to promote to a queen, I'm forking it again. So I know that probably sounds like a lot, but if you can just remember that if your knight cannot occupy the promotion square, moving it to a square that actually attacks the promotion square and is within this circuit, this a2, c1, e2 circuit, white is still going to be able to draw. You just don't white to be in this circuit. Right? So this is another circuit that the white knight could be in, but the problem is this circuit's a lot tighter, and so it's easier for the black king to move around and attack the white knight, as opposed to the e2, c1, and a2 circuit, which is a lot more spread out, and so the black king has to spend more time to get to the white knight, and once the black king spends that time, the white knight can move back around. Okay, so there's one exception to this rule. So we're taking a look at central pawns, and you might have noticed that I said if the pawn is on the C, D, E, or F file, then these are the strategies you should employ. Try and occupy the promotion square with your knight. If you can't, at least try to attack the promotion square with your knight. The problem becomes, though, is if the black's pawn were not on the C file, but we're actually on either the B file or the G file, in which case black can still win. So this position is exactly the same as the last position I showed you. Remember, this position was where we had the black pawn on C2. Now we're looking at a position where everything shifted over one square. But this is actually completely losing for white. The same idea doesn't apply. If I play what worked before, knight d2 or knight e2 in the previous example, now when black's king plays his king to c1, this knight b3 idea doesn't work because after the next move, white's knight would really like to come to the square to the left of a2, but that square doesn't exist. And so all black really needs to play is king d1. And again, if I could get my knight over to the imaginary square to the left of a2, this would be a draw, but that square doesn't exist. And so after king d1, there's simply no good square for the knight to go to stop the pawn from promoting to b1. And so this will end up being a win for black. So just to recap everything we just went over, if you can, for central pawns, for C, D, E, and F pawns, if you can get your knight in front of the promotion square, in this case it would be D1, it's a dead draw. If you can't get your knight in front of the promotion square, at least continue to try to get your knight within this circuit, this more spread out circuit. And if you can do that, it's still going to be a draw because black's pawn will never be able to promote due to knight fork threats like the one we're seeing here. And the last thing to note is the only exception to this is if the pawn is a B or a G pawn, or a knight pawn as we would call it, in which cases we're seeing, as we saw here, there is simply no way that white's knight would be able to stop the black pawn from promoting. So hopefully this made some sense to you guys. If you were able to understand the first two videos of rook pawns, which I think are a lot more complicated than these, you should be able to understand the ideas behind central pawns. The next video that I'm going to make is going to be the very rare knight versus pawn checkmates. So where the white knight can actually checkmate the black king when the black king only has a pawn left. Typically, you can't checkmate with just a king and a knight. But there are some interesting patterns where you actually can force the king to smother himself, and then you can deliver mate with a knight. And so we'll show a couple of those checkmating patterns, and then our last video will just be synthesizing all of this information by going over various puzzles. So thanks everyone for watching. Stay tuned for my next video.